Hey guys, today I have all these beautiful red jalapeno peppers, so let's make a hot sauce out of them. Additional ingredients for this sauce are going to be an onion and some garlic, plus I have a few shallots just laying around, so I figured I would add them, and then some salt to create a fermentation environment. This is going to be a fermented hot sauce, and I'm going to vacuum seal ferment this one today. So I've got my vacuum sealer out, ready to make some bags and get this one started. Many of your commercially available hot sauces are actually fermented in used whiskey and bourbon barrels, and I've always wondered how much that affects the final flavor of the sauce. So today I'm excited to try and experiment with one of these ferments. I have these bourbon barrel chunks that I use in my smoker, and these are actually pieces of staves from used bourbon barrels. So this thing smells amazing. It's got that nice char on it and the oak smell. Definitely some bourbon soaked into this wood too, and I'm going to put this in with some of the fermented hot sauce as it ferments and see how it affects the flavor. It wouldn't be a good experiment without a control group though. So all I've done is split all of my ingredients in half. One half will get the bourbon barrel chunk in with it as it ferments, and one will just be regular. I wish I had room for a whole used bourbon barrel in my kitchen, but maybe one day. For these fermentation bags, you do want to make them bigger than the ingredients you're going to put in them, though, just to allow room to expand as they start to fill up with some CO2 as a result from the fermentation process. So now that I have both bags made, it's just time to chop up the ingredients. Again, we got half an onion, one shallot, 4 cloves of garlic, a decent amount of peppers for each bag of hot sauce. And that's our raw ingredients. I did realize though that I had some cilantro chilling in my fridge. So I didn't mention that at the beginning of the video, but I'm adding about half a cup of cilantro to each of these bags just for a little more flavor. Maybe don't do this if you have the gene where it tastes like soap, but I like it. To determine how much salt we need to add to these ferments, we first need to weigh them. I prefer to do this in grams just for easy math. So this first one was 466 grams, and then I was actually really impressed because the next one was 457. So I'm within 10 grams of each other on the first try. I think that's close enough. For this sauce, I'm going to aim for 3% salt by weight. So to determine that, I did 466 grams times 0.03, and that got me to 13.98, let's call it 14 grams of salt to add to this bag. Then I'll just repeat the same process for the next bag. I'm using a non-iodized salt here just because some people claim that the iodine can affect the fermentation, but it's easy enough just to add these to the bag and then give the bag a nice shake to get that salt evenly distributed. And last but not least, I'm going to add our used bourbon barrel stave to one of the bags. I did give this a nice rinse just to remove some of the loose charcoal on the inside of the barrel stave. But other than that, I'm just going to nestle it in there down amongst our other ingredients. Here's what our bags looked like before they were sealed. Again, I made them much bigger than needed just to allow room for them to expand as the fermentation happens. But now it's time to vacuum seal them. By using the vacuum sealer to seal our bags, we're removing all of the oxygen from around our ingredients, creating an anaerobic environment that should be perfect for fermentation to occur and transition all these raw ingredients into an amazing hot sauce. And here's what our bags look like post being sealed. These things are actually really pretty with all the colors of our ingredients. And I got lucky on this one with the bourbon barrel chunk in it. It had a sharp corner that pushed into the plastic, but it did not break the seal, which is good. So now that salt will start to pull the moisture out of all of our ingredients. Hopefully, bacteria take hold and begin to ferment all this. We'll check in a week or so. And here's both of our bags exactly 1 week later, and the first thing you'll notice is they're no longer vacuumed. However, our seals are still intact, so all of this air in the bag is actually carbon dioxide that's a byproduct of that fermentation process, and a very good sign that things are going to plan. We also have some nice brine going on in each of the bags, and it's hard to capture on camera, but there are some small air bubbles actively coming out of this brine. So fermentation is still progressing and everything is looking great for 1 week in. Our ingredients look a little bit softer, and I'm sure those flavors are developing as well. So I'll check in with you guys in another week. Okay, so after an additional week, here's what our bags are looking like. This was a 2 week total ferment, and everything is looking great. All that's left to do is to get these open, blended, and turned into some hot sauce. And I'm going to keep the contents of each bag completely separate during that process just to keep a fair experiment. I'll be using the exact same steps for each bag though. In hindsight, I probably didn't need to make the bags quite this big, but it's always good to have that extra space. You don't want one of these popping. But after 2 weeks of anxiously waiting, it's finally time to get into this thing. And man, as soon as I cut open the bag, I was just hit with the most amazing smell from these ingredients. The fermented peppers and onions smell so good. And off camera, I did test the pH of this brine, and we're sitting just below 4, around 3.8. So, in addition to imparting those excellent flavors, this ferment also did a good job of preserving our sauce. And that being said, I want to cover one thing. As soon as this is blended up, we have successfully made a fermented hot sauce. So, everything else you see in this video will be completely optional. It's just things that I'm choosing to do with my sauce. I get some criticism sometimes in the comments for adding vinegar or pasteurizing the sauce, and I'll try to explain why I do those things. But I will acknowledge that as soon as this is blended, we could decide to be done and the sauce would be perfectly safe to consume. I did try some as soon as I did this, but I'm going to take it a few steps further. So, first off, the sauce is more like a salsa right now. It's very thick, so I wanted to thin it out some, and I decided to use distilled white vinegar to do that. So, I first added 1/4 cup of distilled white vinegar and then blended it again. The sauce was still looking very thick though, so I decided to add an additional 1/4 cup of distilled white vinegar and then blended it again, and that was a much better consistency. So in total, we're sitting at 1/2 cup of distilled white vinegar added to this mash, primarily to thin it out a bit, but I also like the flavor that distilled white vinegar adds to a hot sauce. It's kind of that classic hot sauce punchy flavor. And again, I'll be using these same steps for both bags of our ingredients to keep the experiment fair. So now I'm going to pasteurize this hot sauce by heating it to at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes while stirring it. And the primary reason I'm going to do that is to stop the fermentation because I am going to bottle this hot sauce for friends and family, and I don't want pressure to build in those bottles if the fermentation were to continue. Even after adding the vinegar, I'm still not super happy with the consistency of this hot sauce. There's a lot of pulp in it because my blender isn't that great, so it's still more of a salsa. And at this point, I decided to strain some of that pulp out just using a fine metal mesh. This did a really good job, and as I'm kind of forcing the sauce through the mesh, you can see that pure liquid fire coming out the bottom, and I also just love the color that this hot sauce came out in. But after ladling our entire pot of hot sauce through this mesh and into the new pot, I switched to a small rubber spatula and just continued to use it to try to force as much liquid as I possibly could out of this pulp into our hot sauce. And when we were done, we were left with a decent amount of pulp as well as a pot full of pure liquid, amazing looking hot sauce. I do think part of the character of a homemade hot sauce, though, is having some pulp in there. So I added a little bit of our pulp back into the sauce just to have that homemade feel and gave it a stir. And here you can see the final consistency of our hot sauce. And all that's left now is to bottle the sauce. I threw that pot back on the stove and got it heated back up to do a hot fill bottling process. This is a hot fill flip. After I filled these, I flipped them over in the box the bottles came in just to sanitize the lids as well. And another reason I was so focused on the consistency of this sauce is I wanted to use a dropper on the bottles just for a classic hot sauce application. But here it is, our final sauce. And that first standard batch yielded 3 3-ounce bottles as well as a little more for sampling. Now it's time to go cook an additional batch, the bag that contained our piece of oak barrel, and see if there are any differences. Again, I'm going to cook it all the exact same way, adding a 1/2 cup of vinegar and doing the same bottling. I won't make you guys watch all of those steps for a second time, but I did want to show you the piece of oak barrel being removed from the bag. It looks relatively unchanged, but let's get into this and then check out the final sauces. Visually, there is no difference between the two batches. I even had to put an X on the bottom of the bottles that contained the bourbon barrel just to be able to distinguish it during my flavor testing with friends and family. I thought that the bourbon barrel one might come out a bit darker, but they look the exact same. So, that being said, let's talk about the flavor differences that this bourbon barrel imparted on the batch that was fermented containing it. I and 3 other people did a blind taste test of the two sauces, and to my surprise, 3 out of the 4 of us could tell a clear difference in the 2 batches. Not saying that one batch was better than the other, but they had some clear differences, and I took notes that we can go through now of some of the most common observations. The most significant difference that was observed by most people was that the batch without the bourbon barrel was hotter than the batch fermented with the bourbon barrel. The bourbon barrel piece had somehow made the sauce milder. I feel like this difference alone could have contributed to all of our other observations. Nobody claimed to taste bourbon or oak in the sauce with the bourbon barrel stave, but 3 of us did notice a difference in the flavor. 2 out of the 3 of us found that the sauce with the bourbon barrel chunk in it came out sweeter than the sauce without the bourbon barrel chunk in it. And the third one of us that could tell a difference in the flavors claimed that the sauce with the bourbon barrel chunk in it had more depth of flavor than the sauce without. He said he could tell the onion and garlic and all those other flavors of the red jalapenos coming through just that much stronger in this sauce. So, what do you guys think? Is there something to this? And should I try to get my hands on a used bourbon barrel to continue my experimentation? For now, I'm using the rest of those chunks as intended on my smoker to impart flavor in a different way on some red jalapenos I'm smoking into chipotles, as well as a nice brisket. But I hope you guys enjoyed this experiment. Let me know in the comments if you did. Give this video a thumbs up, and if you're still watching but haven't already, please subscribe. Thanks again.